The Seattle Times, though, gosh, every once in a while they truly disappoint me. And this is one of those instances. You had this unprecedented situation. The first time the Attorney General's office under Bob Ferguson has ever charged an officer with murder, let alone 3 officers charged in a death. And you had an acquittal. And it's Attorney General Bob Ferguson's 0 for 4 when it comes to prosecutions against police officers. So rather than the media looking at, okay, should these cases have even been brought in the first place? Is there any sort of political implications here? Is there any sort of political agenda here? No, they paint it as a miscarriage of justice. This article in the Times, which was written by a columnist, which to me and to my trained eyes as a former journalist says it's an opinion piece, but as Nicole had pointed out on the Sunday show, it was not clearly labeled as an opinion piece, which I thought was really disappointing and also really misleading to readers. The Times wrote in this, no justice for Manny Ellis in trial of Tacoma police officers. It says, while the trial itself would likely not have happened if not for the gains of I-940, the way the trial was conducted and its outcome was reminiscent of the same stacked deck that has characterized police accountability cases in the U.S. since forever. So again, they're painting, even after a jury, multiple investigations into these officers' actions, a full jury trial, full airing of the evidence, as Jay Inslee called it, and then acquittal for each of the officers. And still the media says that just means there's a stacked deck, as opposed to saying, okay, well, maybe that means that they were innocent. Maybe that means that they were truly innocent under the law. So Anne Bremner is an attorney who we've had on the show before because she takes on a lot of high-profile cases. In fact, she was a defense attorney for Pierce County Sheriff Ed Troyer, who was prosecuted by the Attorney General's office and then acquitted, just like these 3 officers. So she was hired to represent Officer Timothy Rankine, who his role in this is interesting because he wasn't one of the 2 officers who were charged with murder who were initially on scene. He was charged with manslaughter, and he had been called to the scene to assist. So Anne Bremner was his attorney. He was obviously acquitted of all charges. She agreed to come on and talk to us not only about that moment and what that officer has been through, but also about the larger political environment. Anne Bremner, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this is the second time you've represented a law enforcement officer who has been charged by the Attorney General's office. It's the second time your client has been acquitted. Are these just weak cases, or are you a good attorney, or both?
I wish I was that good of an attorney to attribute all of these results to my, work. But the fact is that I had other people working with me in Sheriff Troyer's case, the first one he mentioned, and also in Tim Rankin's case, the Ellis case. A lot of help, a lot of talent. But also, I don't think either of these cases should ever have been brought. We only know 2 of these cases against law enforcement brought by the AGs were brought in Pierce County, and I defended both of them. And I don't believe that either case should have seen the light of day in a courtroom. At least should not have. It should have been more. They should have been more carefully scrutinized. I'll say that at a minimum.
Yeah, we'll get to that at the end because I think that is part of this broader conversation. The AG's office being 0 for 4 in prosecutions against police. I certainly have my opinion. I'm sure it's similar to yours. But we've seen, we saw the moment that not only Officer Rankine, but the other officers involved were acquitted by a jury of their peers. What was that moment like sitting there next to him?
I cried. He cried. My co-counsel cried. I didn't expect to, but it was so overwhelmingly emotional, Brandi, that, 3 months of trial, years of this case dragging on. Our client had 10, 15 members of his family in there every day, his parents, his in-laws. It was just overwhelming. And we felt such gratitude to the jury for their hard work and consideration of the facts, the true facts.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to discount the pain and the emotion for Manny Ellis's family
No.
either. I mean, there's no winners in this case. However, the media coverage has sort of solely focused on the reaction of Manny Ellis's family and the emotion from that side. But can you characterize what your client has been through over the past 2 years?
I almost liken it to something that's like Kafkaesque. Remember the book, The Trial by Franz Kafka? I think he was from the Czech Republic, and you don't even know why you're there. You thought you did everything right. These officers all said right after it happened, we didn't see anything, to scrutinize. Of course, it was a tragedy, but I think Officer Collins said, never in my wildest dreams did I ever dream I would be in a courtroom, let alone a criminal courtroom. So it's been very difficult. And we heard from Officer Ford, my client's partner. His name's Messiah Ford. And he was not charged. He's African American, and he's been called a racist. He's been threatened. He's gotten off social media. So it's not just the officers themselves, but there's a lot of, the collateral damage to people in this case, including families. And the final thing I'll say on that is they were all getting together at the family of my client, Officer Rankine, at Thanksgiving, and they started talking about Christmas, and they all got silent because they were like, are we going to be together at Christmas? Or is Timothy going to be in jail? I mean, that's what they've dealt with for a long time.
Yeah. Well, and certainly the unknown and the uncertainty around that isn't over. I mean, he's been acquitted on the criminal charges, which is obviously good for him and for his family. But we're expecting really any day now the Tacoma Police Department to decide his fate as a police officer with that agency. What is your expectation there?
Well, you never want to say never, of course, Brandi, as you know, but I just can't imagine how after this detailed examination of this case with all the witnesses and all the evidence could have any different result with disciplinary action versus this jury verdict in a criminal case where the burden, of course, is pretty high for the state to prove. But there were no policy violations. There was no testimony about anything that would lead to a conclusion they should be disciplined, let alone terminated.
But at the same time, the mayor of Tacoma came out 2 years ago prior to any sort of trial and said these officers should be fired. So I guess I'm trying to square that comment now with the political wins and the decision that they have before them.
Sometimes, people get out ahead of their skis, over their skis. And I know that she has come back and walked back some of those comments, which I credit, her for. That was an initial reaction that she had. It was unfortunate. And it turns out that what she had to say wasn't borne out by the facts once there was a full examination of the evidence.
That being said, it's a question of, I know that the police chief came out and said after the verdict that within 2 weeks they'd have a decision. I believe 2 weeks would be this Thursday or Friday. So there's a question of what are they going to do in terms of any discipline for these officers, but there's also the question of whether your client, Officer Rankine, wants to be an officer anymore.
Exactly.
Does he want to continue to serve as a Tacoma police officer?
Brandi, I can't really tell you that right now. I think he's given that a lot of thought, but he hasn't really landed, in terms of a position on that. I can tell you that Sheriff Ed Troyer offered to hire all three of these officers, which I really, he's a great guy. Of course, I represented him and he was acquitted in an AG case, but I really appreciated that. And the officers did too. But I don't think there's a definitive answer yet from Timothy Rankine. He was a kid when he came on when this happened. He was a brand new officer. He was by far the most junior. He'd barely, gotten into the job when all this happened. And he was a backup officer. He didn't know what happened. He got there and helped to restrain somebody that was violently resisting the police. And then he ended up charged with manslaughter.
Yeah, and in that regard, for people who didn't follow the trial every day, and if you've had a chance to talk to the jury, obviously it's a little bit of a different case for your client for the reason you just expressed. He was called there on backup. He wasn't there for the entirety of the ordeal. Are there specific pieces of evidence that you believe really contributed to the jury verdict, to the acquittal?
Yeah, there are a number of things. Number one, they did say that they did not find those quote unquote eyewitnesses that were so heralded in the print media to be truly credible. And it was put out again and again and again that eyewitnesses said that the officers were the aggressors. There was video evidence, but it was very partial, and they had to enhance it. There was audio evidence, they had to enhance it. So obviously it's not what was seen that night, it's not what was heard that night. And those quote unquote eyewitnesses were balanced out by witnesses on the other side that said there was a struggle, there was a brawl, that Ellis was throwing around the officers, quote unquote, pretty good. So that was one piece. And that was a lot of what they said their case was, the AG. But the medical examiner himself, Dr. Clark, kind of the star witness, he said on cause of death that he couldn't say particularly that there was one particular cause of death. He talked about a spit hood. He talked about meth in the fatal range that he said could be considered, quote unquote, the primary factor in the death. And when he was cross-examined, he basically would say, I cannot definitively give you this cause of death with this individual. Even though it was reported that he did, it was really a mixed bag. So how can you convict if you don't know how he died? How can you convict someone of murder or manslaughter and killing someone if you don't even know if that person or persons had something to do with the death, the mechanism of the death? So those are big things, but I think the officer's testimony was big. I think they're very credible. I think Officer Ford was very credible. And the jury heard what happened. Great jury, attentive jury. 3 months, they came in every day, and they never missed a day, didn't miss a beat. There were some COVID illnesses where people had to step aside. But I was so impressed with this jury. There were protesters out front. There were all kinds of, I think, pressures on them. And they did exactly what they were there to do. They rose to occasion, something bigger than themselves, and rendered a true verdict based on the facts and the evidence.
And you mentioned, something that's important, and this goes for any sort of use of force incident with a police officer that winds up in the news. You have court, and then you have the court of public opinion. You've got a mayor who says fire them, before they've had their day in court. You've got the media, as you said. After this verdict, it was painted in many news publications as a miscarriage of justice, as a stacked deck. I mean, the Seattle Times article we've talked about on our show. I guess, is there ever going to be a way around, you think, having gone through this with 2 police officers now being acquitted, is there ever going to be a way around this sort of different standard that officers are held to in the court of public opinion?
I did write a book, and I'm not plugging the book, except for it's called Justice in the Age of Judgment. I wrote with my brother about media impact on these criminal trials, high-profile trials. And I bring it up because you magnify that tenfold in a police case, as you know, and especially after the quote unquote summer of love or the pandemic and unrest we had in 2020 when this case was charged. So I've defended police officers, for 35 years, Seattle, Portland, King County, Bellevue, and in wrongful death cases and use of force cases. But I've never seen it quite like this in the last 3-4 years of how difficult it is to represent police officers. The pendulum swings. I hope people get to understand we need public safety, we need good officers, and we can't vilify people and take a whole movement and put it into a criminal case and convict the innocents, those that didn't do anything wrong, based upon our sentiments about bigger policy and societal issues and police issues.
Yeah, and that's where I want to take this. Attorney General Bob Ferguson, not to make this political,
right.
I believe these were political prosecutions. I've said that publicly. You've got an attorney general who is now, as I said, 0 for 4 in prosecutions brought against police officers. And this is someone who very well may be the next governor of Washington State. I mean, do you believe that these are decisions that are being impacted by political considerations?
Well, I've said that publicly before. And I said that in Sheriff Troyer's case, that was something that was politically driven, that there was not evidence to support that charge. And we tried to get that in front of a jury. The judge said no, but I did argue in motions it was politically driven by someone who was considering running for governor. In this case, there were, I think, 7 assistant attorney general lawyers, a number of them in private practice at great expense to the public. You have to wonder, why this case? I've tried other cases where police had deaths ensue, unfortunately and tragically, like in this case, with some lawful restraint, methamphetamine or cocaine toxicity or overdose, excited delirium, and other heart problems, atherosclerotic disease, and types of weakened hearts from drug use. So I've seen exactly this kind of scenario in the past. And those were cases where at inquests, officers were cleared. But then this case, given the timing, and I think by whom it was brought, we have to look at why was this brought, when it was brought, and look at what the officers went through. I don't think it should have been charged.
Yeah, and you bring up lawful restraint, and look, laws have changed as a result of this, and that's fine if you look at tactics that officers use, and lawmakers want to change things, but you still have to judge the officers based on what their training and what was allowed at the time that this happened. And let's end with this. Is there anything your client, in hindsight, would have done differently that night?
That's a good question for him. I've never asked him that, but I think the answer would be no. He feels terribly that Manny Ellis died. I know Manny Ellis was very loved by his family. I got to know his sister, his mom. They're wonderful people. He had a lot of supporters and family. And I think the loss of a life is something that you wish would never happen. And he did testify to that. Got emotional about it and said, I just wish this had never happened. But it did. And hopefully we can all learn from it, including as to whether or not these cases should go forward. And I do want to say to the family again, we know it's a tragedy, and they've really lost somebody special to them.
All right, Anne Bremner, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and for getting involved in these cases that are difficult politically. They're difficult from a public opinion perspective. And I really think that you're owed a debt of gratitude for the types of cases that you choose to get involved in. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You are owed a debt of gratitude for everything you do, including in the other Ellis case, Brandi, where on the sentencing that you highlighted for people in terms of an injustice in Pierce County that occurred during this trial, or almost occurred, but didn't.
Yeah, it was good to see a different outcome in that case. Anne, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just say, at any time, we should be hearing whether there'll be any sort of discipline from the Tacoma Police Department for these officers. I share Anne's sentiments that, given the investigations, given the evidence that was presented at trial, I can't see how they could do that unless it was political, which I'm not ruling out. But I find it very unlikely that any of these officers would continue on with the Tacoma Police Department and even in the profession. I mean, when you really think about what they went through for the past 2 years, the way they've been vilified by activists and by the media, how could they continue to patrol the streets of Tacoma? I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't want my loved one to do it. And so, there's going to be a broader conversation moving forward about Bob Ferguson and about the way that he's utilized his office. And police officers aren't perfect. Is it possible, and have in the past police officers used force excessively? Of course. That would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise. But you are 0 for 4, Bob Ferguson, on prosecuting police officers who have been cleared by a jury of their peers. And if that doesn't do some soul searching for you or your supporters to really, really find out, were these cases that were sound? Were these cases that would have been brought in any other scenario? I mean, this is not something that I'm going to let go as long as he's running to be the governor of Washington State. And I can only hope that the people of this state choose someone who is more qualified for the job in terms of not using the power of their offices to go after citizens of the state of Washington.